So a brief overview of the agenda of the event. We're going to start with a welcome and brief introduction to the Northeast Risk. Then we'll have a context presentation and a brief resource demo. Then we'll move into a large group discussion and finally wrap up with a Q&A and a wrap up and brief survey. So if you're new here, welcome. We are the Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Network, an organization that aims to reduce the compounding effects of invasive species and climate change through science synthesis, information sharing, and conducting priority research. Risk started in the Northeast and was born from the needs expressed by invasive species practitioners to better understand how climate change would impact their work. The first network meeting occurred in 2016, and we've been growing steadily ever since. The Northeast Risk resources and events are the product of the hard work of a large volunteer leadership team, and this group of about 40 people hold weekly working meetings to coordinate events, synthesize science, and conduct original research. But the Northeast Risk includes a broader network of over 750 people who engage through events that make Northeast Risk a useful resource. So thank you all for coming. Feel free to connect with us if you haven't already. You can visit us online at risknetwork.org/northeast, and you can also join our listserv on this website. And you can also contact us through email through the emails displayed right now on the slide. Okay, so some ground rules before we get into the content portion of the talk. We may not all agree on the topics discussed today. Please remember that everyone is here to learn. Leave space for others to share their perspective, be an active listener, contribute your own thoughts, and discuss respectfully. So before I dive into the details of our new resource, I want to acknowledge that I did not do all this work alone. So I'd like to introduce my co-authors on this resource here. You may see some of them participating in the discussion portion of the event later on, and they include Bethany Bradley, Carolyn Marshner, Eve Beery, Jenica Allen, Kabira Singh, Matt Brinka, Suvi Birch, and Thomas Nuhfer. So our newest research to practice paper follows a series of previous resources created by the Northeast Risk team about the relationships between the ornamental plant trade, plant invasions, climate change, and the opportunity to plant native species in the place of non-natives. We hope our previous and most recent resource enable you all to teach others about the use of native plants. And our past research to practice papers on this subject include Why Native, Do Not Sell, and our first iteration of climate smart gardening. We've since expanded upon this resource and created Climate Smart Gardening 2.0, in which we present state-specific lists of native and near-native plants expected to persist in the Northeast with continued climate change. And that's what we'll be talking a bit more about today. So an outline of the context portion of the presentation. We're going to go over the benefits of native gardening, some of the barriers people face when they are attempting to create a native garden, how climate change affects gardening, how we created our new resource. Then we'll go into the brief demo and move into the large group discussion. So a garden filled with native plants provides benefits compared to a non-native garden. Firstly, native plants support a greater diversity of native wildlife, and they also have less risk of invasion. So native plants are less likely to escape gardens and become established in the landscape and then subsequently have negative consequences. Native gardens support your local ecosystem. These benefits are emphasized here that there's a 50% higher abundance of native birds, a 9 times higher abundance of rare birds, 3 times more butterfly species, 2 times higher abundance of native bees, and 2 times caterpillar diversity in native trees compared to gardens with non-native plants. And this all comes from the risk research to practice paper, Why Native, that I mentioned earlier, if you're interested in looking into more details. So native plants are also less likely to have negative consequences than non-native species if they escape from gardens and establish in the natural environment. A study from 2012 looked at all the vascular plants present in the United States and identified how many became invasive. For plants native to North America, this was less than 0.5%, but for non-native species, more than 10% become invasive. An example of one of these species is burning bush, or Euonymus elatus, which is native to Eastern Asia and was introduced through the ornamental plant trade in the late 19th century. It has since escaped cultivation and is now invasive in the understory of many forests in the Northeast region. which chokes out native species that would have grown in their place. Harm like this is not nearly as common with native species that could escape your garden. And of course, also native species are just as beautiful. These are some pictures from a native meadow here in Hadley, Massachusetts, that one of our co-authors grows. So despite these many benefits, the ornamental plant trade is mostly made up of non-native species, which have detrimental impacts on our environment. One study found that 80% of the nursery stock in the US could be considered non-native. And this really serves as a barrier to consumers interested in planting native. It's difficult to understand what native species they should be planting and also which native plants are actually available in the market for sale. Another barrier is climate change. Climate change is happening very fast, and in less than 100 years, the Massachusetts climate is expected to shift to the equivalent of about 400 to 800 miles south. And in response to this, plants will need to move great distances to track their preferred climate, which study shows they are not doing fast enough on their own. In fact, native plant species have been found to be spreading at a rate about 20 times slower than is needed to keep up with the pace of climate change. And these changes are already noticeable in the last decade, as shown by shifting hardiness zones from the 1990s to today and projected to mid-century. Plant hardiness zones are based on minimum winter temperatures and are an estimate used by gardeners to determine what can grow at a given location. We can see that since the 1990s, hardiness zones have shifted by about half a zone, corresponding to a 5-degree increase in minimum winter temperature. And by 2050, another half shift in hardiness zone is expected. So these changing conditions are also changing what species can survive and will survive in gardens throughout our region. Therefore, gardeners will need to consider what species will persist in their area as the climate continues to change. So this is where what we call climate smart gardening comes into play, which is planting for present and future conditions using native and near native species adapted to both current and future hardiness zones. I'm going to break down and expand on these next terms a little bit later, but for now, here's some definitions of how we're going to classify species in our resource. We define persistent species as species which are suitable for both current and future hardiness zones in a given state. Native species are species historically found growing without human intervention in a given state. And near native species are species that are not native to a given state, but are native to a nearby state with a shared level 3 ecoregion. So the following slides are going to be hypothetical examples from the perspective of a gardener based in Massachusetts to better explain these concepts. So this map shows areas of environmental suitability, which is basically the range of USDA hardiness zones that the species can tolerate of a plant species being considered for a garden. So areas of current suitability are in blue, the future in yellow, and the overlap where conditions will persist in green. You can see the historic range of this species, which is the small little plants in orange, is native to Massachusetts and falls within the green area of persistent conditions under future climate change. We, therefore, would classify the species as a persistent native, and it would be a good species to plant in the garden in Massachusetts. Plant communities often don't follow political boundaries, though, and that's where USDA ecoregions can help us determine what species are okay to plant across state lines. USDA ecoregions are a way of identifying areas of ecological similarity. So the black outline you can see on this map here to the coast of New England is all areas that fall within the northeastern coastal zone ecoregion. So areas within the same ecoregion would be expected to have similar geology, landforms, soils, vegetation, climate, land use, wildlife, and hydrology. Therefore, you would expect similar plant communities and a shared evolutionary history across state lines, which overlap the same ecoregion, and plants within them to be safe to plant if environmental conditions persist across state lines. For additional context, here is what the level 3 ecoregions look like at a national scale. The ecoregion I just introduced can be seen next to the arrow on the right. So hopefully this map gives you an idea of the size of the level 3 ecoregions we are making use of in our resource. We only include near native species on a state list if the focal state shares at least one level 3 ecoregion in which the species is native. So as an example of these near native species, let's say we're interested in understanding whether this purple species, as you can see here in Connecticut, the little purple plants, is appropriate to plant in Massachusetts. We know its historic range is in Connecticut, but falls within an ecoregion shared within Massachusetts. We can also see that areas of suitability for this species are expected to persist within Massachusetts under future climate conditions. And therefore, we would classify this species as a persistent near-native species in Massachusetts. By planting near-native species, as displayed here, you can actually help facilitate their movement, tracking suitable habitat poleward in response to warming conditions. As we know that, as I explained earlier, the pace of climate change is much faster than native species will be able to move on their own. So because this movement is occurring within states of a shared ecoregion, the geographic distance the species is actually moving is not too great, which reduces any risk of invasive behaviors while promoting climate adaptation. So to summarize what I've gone over so far, the problems people encounter when trying to plant native gardens include that they don't know what native species to plant in their area. It's hard to actually know which species are actually available in trade, and also that climate change is going to alter what species will persist in a given area. So to address this problem, our newest research to practice paper contains lists of climate-smart native and near-native plants that are expected to persist under future climate conditions for use by home gardeners. We're calling this resource Climate Smart Gardening 2.0, as I mentioned, because it's an expansion of our first Climate Smart Gardening resource that we released in 2020. So now I'm going to dive a little bit into the details of how we created this resource. So to create lists of climates resilient native plant species in each state, we surveyed 339 nurseries in 15 states in the mid-Atlantic and northeastern United States for native species currently for sale. And you can see the map of these nurseries displayed on the right side of this slide. And this is an example on the left of a catalog from a nursery in Pennsylvania where we extracted data from. So we went through the catalogs, found all the native species that were in them, and recorded them as available for sale. And through this process, we were able to identify 1,472 species native to the continental United States at large. So we started with what's offered for sale in nurseries, or we took this approach because we wanted to ensure that what we're actually recommending for planting is commercially available. And this addresses that common problem I went over earlier encountered by users of other native plant lists. We then standardized all the taxonomy of the different species to the World Flora Online taxonomic backbone, and to account for the fact that scientific names are changing all the time and different names can be used to mean the same species. So we wanted to make sure that all the names we found in the catalogs were standardized and meant the same species that they were referring to. We then appended growth, aesthetic, and ecological information for each species to allow the user to filter species for their specific gardening project or use. Some examples are habit, sun level, color, its height, and benefits to various animals like birds, mammals, insects, or reptiles. All of this information came from resources like the Missouri Botanical Gardens Plant Finder tool, Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, the Department of Transportation's Ecoregional Revegetation application, the Manual of Woody Landscape Plants, and A to Z Encyclopedia of Garden Plants. So the states lists each species is native to was then appended from the World Checklist of Vascular Plants, which is basically a large macroscale resource tracking the native ranges of plant species. We also then flagged aggressive or weedy species based on descriptions from the Missouri Botanic Gardens Plant Finder tool. And it's important to note that any species we mark as aggressive or weedy, which are native to a state, may be desirable in some cases as a ground cover or otherwise, and are actually not descriptions of the species as invasive. So they don't have negative consequences on the surrounding environment. They just spread quickly throughout your garden. It's something you should take note of. We then applied a bunch of data filters. So species for which we found no optimal hardiness zone information, we removed. We then filtered out rare, threatened, or endangered species from states where they're listed. So one example is Viola rotundifolia. It's endangered in Rhode Island and imperiled in Delaware. So that species would not be recommended for planting in those states to avoid the wild collection of or the introduction of inappropriate genotypes near wild populations. So we removed any species from states where they were regulated or listed as threatened or endangered. We also excluded any native species regulated by any state within our region. So, for example, Robinia pseudoacacia or the black locust tree often behaves like an invasive species. It can escape gardens and take over local ecosystems. So it's not recommended for planting in home gardens. And because it was regulated in a number of states within our region, we removed it from all state lists within our footprint. We then identified climate-smart native plant species, and to do this, we investigated it, as I mentioned earlier, if hardiness zones persist in each state by mid-century under worst-case future climate conditions for each species. A climate persister can survive current and future conditions within a state. So, for example, in Massachusetts, this would be a species which can persist despite the loss of hardiness zones 5 and 6 in the state by mid-century, which is predicted. We also went through and removed anything classified as near native species if it was native to a state which did not share a level 3 ecoregion with the focal state. So, for example, a species native to only Connecticut and therefore near native to Massachusetts would be included on the Massachusetts list because they share the northeastern coastal zone ecoregion. But a species native to only Virginia would not because Virginia and Massachusetts do not share any level 3 ecoregions. So here are some example species of how we classified them as climate smart relative to a gardener in Massachusetts. But these concepts were applied to any of the states that are included in our list. So starting with American holly or Ilex opaca, it's native to Massachusetts and has an optimal hardiness zone of 5 to 9. These hardiness zones are present currently and are predicted to persist by mid-century in the state. So we classify it as a persistent native and we encourage its planting by home gardeners in Massachusetts. Next is Rhododendron arborescens. It's not native to Massachusetts historically, but it is native to nearby Pennsylvania, which shares the northeastern highlands ecoregion with Massachusetts. Its optimal hardiness zone range is 4 to 7, which will persist under current and future climate conditions in Massachusetts. So we therefore classify this as a near native species, which is a good candidate to be planted by home gardeners in Massachusetts. Conversely, fire cherry or Prunus pennsylvanica, which we know this species is native to Massachusetts and can survive under current hardiness zones in the state. But by mid-century, though, the 2 to 6 optimal hardiness zone for this species will be lost as the lowest zone in Massachusetts is predicted to be 7. So this is a species gardeners would not want to plant as it will not persist, and we categorize it as a native loss, and it's not included on any state lists. One note of caution, though, on what we classify as persistent near-native species. So near-native species are color-coded in the resource separately from native species so that they're easily distinguishable from one another. We did this because persistent near-native species aren't historically native to the focal state. Most of the near-native species on our list have a very low risk of invasion, especially because we filtered to only near-native species which share a level 3 ecoregion with the focal state. But there is a non-zero risk that still exists. We base this decision on an attempt to balance the minimal potential risk of invasive behaviors by some near-native species and the current available science in which we understand that native species are spreading 20 times slower than the pace of climate change and will not be able to keep up on their own, making some movements of species necessary to facilitate their survival. So just a word of caution there. Finally, we had our list reviewed by botanical experts to filter out species that could be problematic in their region. We gathered feedback through 2 workshops with different versions of these lists and collected valuable feedback from each. We also had separate individual reviews from 13 botanical, ecological, and horticultural experts from states across our region, including Karen Lombard, Alyssa Siegel-Miles, and Victoria Wallace. There's some pictures here on this slide of the 2 workshops we ran. One was at the New York Invasive Species Expo in September 2023, which was a very early version of the resource, so we got some great direction there. And then later on at the Cornell Cooperative Extension Agriculture, Food, and Environmental Systems in Service in November of 2024, we got some feedback on a later version of that resource. So an example of some of the helpful feedback we received was the identification of several species which are susceptible to widespread pests or pathogens. So one example is Fraxinus or ash and Ulmus species or elm. And we subsequently removed these as they would not make good persistent garden plants that we don't want to encourage the spread of disease as well. So overall, dataset stats, the resulting 15 state lists contain between 539 to 770 native and near-native species, which are confirmed to be commercially available and predicted to persist under future climate conditions throughout the Northeast. And with that, I'm going to pass things over to Thomas Nuhfer, who's going to walk us through the actual resource and how you can make use of it. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, folks. So I'm just going to share my screen for a moment. I'm Thomas, and I'll give you a quick preview of what the dataset resource looks like. Jenica shared a link to this in the chat, so you can also download it yourself and explore along with me or in your own time. So just for a super quick preview, when you download this dataset resource, you're going to get an Excel file that you can also open up, in any other sort of spreadsheet application with all these tabs along the bottom. This first README tab goes over sort of our metadata and a lot of the information that Matt's just shared about how the data set was created. So if you have questions about who participated in this effort, how to cite it, where our data came from, or how different designations were made, this is the place to come check. And one important part of this I'll highlight is this section here, which shows the name and description of each of the columns that you'll see on the state list. So if there's something that you're confused about, you can come check it out in this README tab. And we have more information again here just about how it was put together and sort of what designations we've assigned to these species. So then I'm going to go ahead and select my state, Massachusetts, and you can, pick this tab for the area that you're planning on gardening in. And you'll get this sort of big plant list with a whole bunch of ecological information like Matt just described. We've got our scientific name, our common name or common names, growth habit, our minimum and maximum hardiness zone that the plant can tolerate, our climate status column, and I'll just point out here that that's where that persistent native or persistent near native distinction comes into play. In response to some feedback we received in the process of creating this resource, we wanted to be sure to delineate those really clearly. So our persistent near natives have this gray shading that you'll see. So that's what that gray shading is in the data set. Speaking of shade, we also have sun level information and moisture level. So these are all, attributes that you could use to filter down your list to find plants, that fit your garden project or your site. We also have some more descriptive information like the soil type column. We have the bloom period for the plant in question, the color or colors of the flowers, some columns about whether there's interesting foliage or showy flowers, our height in feet, that garden aggressive column. So again, that's not indicating an invasive species, but just one that may be aggressive in a garden context. So you might want to keep an eye on whether whether we had evidence documenting the plant providing bird, mammal, insect, or reptile or amphibian ecological services. And if you're interested in pollinators, you can get a little more detail about what sort of pollinator the plant may support. This column that describes rare status in states within the Northeast. And so again, a species that was rare or endangered in Massachusetts would have been removed from the Massachusetts list. But this way, say, if you're in maybe Eastern Connecticut and a species is listed as rare in Rhode Island, that may be one that you want to seek out a little more guidance about. And then some description of propagation methods. And so where you see NAs in these columns, that may just indicate that there weren't data available for that species in that category. So if you see an NA for insect services, we're not saying that that plant doesn't provide insect services, just that it wasn't included in the data sets that we used to put this together. Yep, so you can use these columns to sort and filter the data set as you'd like. So you could, pare this down to only, exclude trees if you've just got a small place to work with, or only look at grasses or vines, filter down, more information based on your sun level, and so on. And I'll just say also that we hope that this is not only the final iteration of this product. We're in the process of working on some more interactive online tools that may expand a little bit the ways that you're able to interact with this resource and make selections and develop a plant list. So keep an ear out for that in the future. That's something that's still in progress. But for now, this resource, these different state lists, can help you filter down a shorter list of species that are suitable for your garden conditions, give you some information about what those species may do in your garden, what they may look like, and then you can take that list of species to your native plant nursery online retailer or so on and buy some of them to plant. So happy gardening. I'll turn it back over to Matt.
Thanks so much, Thomas. I'm going to share my screen again. Okay, so we're now going to move into the large group discussion section of our event, and we're using a platform called Mentimeter so that all of you can engage in the conversation without necessarily unmuting to work through some questions we have prepared. So keep open Mentimeter as we go through the questions. We might turn on and off screen sharing, but you'll want to keep it open so you can participate. So in order to participate, you can either scan the QR code on the screen on your phone, or you can click the link shared in the chat or go to menti.com and use the code on 52827899 on the slide. We'll be answering questions along the way throughout this discussion, as well as have a dedicated Q&A section at the end as time allows, or you can feel free to ask questions in the chat and the co-authors present will address them as we go. So I'd like to now invite my co-authors to join me on screen for this discussion, and I'll pass it over to Jenica Allen, one of the co-authors of the project, who will be leading us through this part of the discussion. And I'll leave this up for a few minutes just so people can scan it.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. So Matt gave some pretty clear instructions. What I will say is we have a series of questions that we'll work through on Menti. And so you'll only see the very first question right now, but you are able to submit multiple responses to it if you have multiple things to say. And I do want to be able to share your responses. So I'll go ahead, thanks, Matt, and share things as they're rolling in. All right. So we're getting some responses in. We've started with the positive things. We recognize that our audience here likely represents a broad variety of gardeners or people that interact with gardeners or are thinking about native plants in a garden context. And so part of this is us trying to understand how you are planning to use it or might use it. And so we're getting responses like it's proactive, some new perspectives, well-informed resources. We appreciate that. We've done our best. All 50 states and territories are going to want this. Good news, there are risks across the country that can pick up this model and create these sorts of resources for their regions, and or maybe we'll get ambitious and expand this project. Who knows? We haven't gotten quite that far in our geographic thinking. Easy to choose a broad diversity of plants in different niches. I'm just going to keep scrolling down. Great for extension folks in master gardener programs. The thing that I appreciate about that comment is we actually involved those folks in the creation of this resource in terms of, one of our co-authors works in extension, but also workshopped with extension folks and master gardener folks to ideally make this a resource that was useful. So one of the things that we're hoping to do is get some perspectives from our audience through using Menti, have our co-author team here that you see on camera to help answer questions or provide perspectives, but also provide you the opportunity if you would like to come off camera and provide any comments that you have. So for each of the questions that we'll ask, we'll just open the floor for a moment. And so I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and just invite anybody who has a word to say in person, or I guess virtually in person, invite you to do that. You should have the capacity to unmute yourselves. We're running this in meeting format. Yeah, Lynn, go ahead.
Dare I ask the dirty word, cultivars, nativars? It's a can of worms, but I'm just going to ask it.
Yeah. So we are gonna get into like questions or things that are maybe confusing or kind of open-ended at this point in our next question. So I'm gonna put a pin in that question until we get to the next segment. But thanks for asking that question. We will circle back to it.
Hi, just wondered, Steve Young, why you use level 4 instead of level 3 ecoregions?
We used level 3 ecoregions.
I mean, level 3 instead of level 4.
Um, yeah, I mean, I feel like a lot of the work that I've seen, I'll just speak for myself and my co-authors can chime in here if they've got other things to add. But a lot of the work that I've seen with the native plant um, gardening movement and sort of production of native plants has really focused on level 3 ecoregions. And so they do feel like a coherent ecological unit, but also they align with at least what I've seen from the Northeast Seed Network, for example, working through how to increase supply of native plant materials in the region.
I would say, I would add to that that, all of this is um, a balance between how far away we're willing to go with recommendations in terms of, do we want to be recommending things that come from Virginia for Massachusetts, for example? And I think we, with a lot of input from, from folks like Steve, have narrowed that down to say that we don't want to necessarily recommend Virginia species to be planted in Massachusetts, because the further away we go, the more potential for kind of unknown interactions, or the more potential for lack of evolutionary history between those plants that could cause surprises. But if we narrow it too much, on the other hand, then we're not being climate proactive in the way that we really know that we need to be, given that, for four of us in the in the spotlight sitting in, or actually three of us sitting in Massachusetts, that the Massachusetts climate right now is more like what northern New Jersey used to be like, when I was a kid, basically. So that's several hundred kilometers already of distance that climate has moved. So if we go too narrow, and say just the local neighborhood, then we're missing out on enabling plants to shift their ranges, or helping plants to shift their ranges in response to climate change. So I would say level 3 is a little bit of our Goldilocks in between too far and too close.
And I'll just chime in one more piece about that, which is that broadly for our purposes, where we were looking at which states share level 3 ecoregions, to consider a species as near native or not. Just the way that those level 3 and level 4 ecoregions, are arranged in the northeastern states within our footprints, we don't actually see, I think, huge differences in terms of which states share those ecoregions, where we have a lot of like sort of north-south oriented ecoregions either way. So all those things that Jenica and Bethany said, but I think it's not a significant, it wouldn't be a significantly different list or designations using the level 4 ecoregions either.
And I'm going to apologize because I put on my facilitator hat to keep us focused on using this resource and then promptly forgot. So we've sort of stepped into, questions that remain. And so I guess why don't we just circle back to Lynn's question too about cultivars and sort of how does that layer in here? One of the pieces of this data set creation was pulling together the species list as one of the very first steps. And we did make the choice to basically strip away any cultivar names that were associated with the species, because we were trying to get to sort of this like core list of species that we could provide. Yeah, this question of cultivars or nativars is one that keeps coming up. It's one that our group is sort of probably turning our attention to next in terms of pulling together what's out there in terms of research that's been done. Sort of absent that comprehensive synthesis right now, what I can say is that there are research projects that have looked at that question in certain groups of plants with certain types of pollinators. So Annie White's thesis, for example, is one of the places where we've got some data. Some of the work that comes out of the Mount Cuba Center, they do a bunch of basically cultivar planting trials. And they've been increasingly over time, including pollinator information in those trials. So basically like visitation rates of different pollinator groups. But I suspect there's even more out there that we haven't put our fingers on yet. And so, yeah, putting that together as a comprehensive resource is something that kind of is on our horizon, I would say, or at least on our radar. Some general rules that I feel like have started to emerge is that like changes in leaf color at least affect lepidopteran use of plants. Double flowers reduce the utility of that plant for pollinators. But I think there's still a lot of open questions about trying to come up with like a comprehensive set of recommendations. But I would say like I want to open this to my co-authors to respond to, but also like if there are folks in the audience that have resources that we don't mention, like please do feel free to share them either verbally or in the chat. This is a hot topic, I'd say.
I'll just say that's definitely on our minds and emphasize what Jenica said about that's where we're going next. We actually have a meeting in a few weeks to think about ideas on cultivars and varieties, and I've done some exploration of the scientific literature on this topic. So we're hoping to maybe we'll go in the direction of some kind of review of the research that's existed so we get a better synthesis of the current understanding. And I know Thomas has done some exploration as well, so maybe I'll let him talk about that a bit too.
Yeah, I don't have much to say about that now, other than it's something that we're poking into. I mean, one of the challenges is that, there's just not a lot of data out there in terms of what cultivars are currently on the market. It's always changing, and then, what traits those cultivars have. So that's something that I'm interested in working on, trying to compile some of that data. But I think there's a lot of, a lot of outstanding questions still and a lot of work to be done.
Okay, so now I'm going to actually, if you go back to Menti, you should see another question, which is basically an opportunity for you to continue to ask the questions that you have, or if there are concepts that we've talked about so far about climate smart gardening that are still kind of muddy for you, to let us know what those are, and our group can try to address them. And so far, we've got a morality question.
I'll add the link to the Menti one more time just in case you've lost it.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt.
Maybe there's no confusion. Maybe it's perfect.
So why risk got into horticulture? And I think I saw a question in the chat too that we can circle back to. There we go. Thanks, Matt, for putting the link. I think that might have been one of the bottlenecks. All right, so we've got a handful of questions or confusing concepts that I think we can address. So I'm going to start by leaving them up on the screen for the moment. And then as we get farther through the conversation, we'll come back to sort of your Hollywood Squares version of your co-authors. And so some straightforward questions that I think we can address to begin with. So does this include pest risks? As Matt mentioned in his overview, we did remove a number of species that were sort of widespread at risk from pest mortality. So species or genera where we expected, if you plant this species, it's just not going to make it at this point. And so, pests like emerald ash borer, for example, or Dutch elm disease, or chestnut blight, would sort of categorically remove those host species from our candidate list. But for species that maybe have cosmetic damage from a pest, so like powdery mildew comes to mind on bee balms, we did not include that sort of information, in part because it's really not accessible in any sort of very organized way, or even a disorganized way that allows us to synthesize and pull that information together. That is a piece of information that we looked for to include in this resource. And it's something that we've discussed as maybe like a next step for Climate Smart Gardening 3.0. But it's not something that is explicitly included here. Trying to think, so we could address most concerns will be about where to get the plants. That's fair. That's why we aimed to start with availability versus a very, very long species list and then filter down. But as we know, inventories do change with regularity. So I think availability will continue to be something that is a challenge. There are some states, like Connecticut comes to mind, that do sort of like an annual update to a native plant availability resource. Maine might have one of these too. Gary, maybe you can chime in the chat if I'm remembering that correctly or incorrectly. So there are particular state-focused efforts to update resources with some level of regularity, but certainly that doesn't exist across all states. Let's see, what other of these can we address? Should we think about local ecotypes and geographic sourcing? I would say it would be great if we could, but in most cases, where plants are coming from is entirely unknown. That's where I will point to the work of the Northeast Seed Network. That is one of the main focal areas that they're working on the supply side, is trying to understand and sort of get producers and retailers on board with identifying the provenance of plant materials. So again, that's sort of a complementary group that's working on some of these issues to try to nudge that along to a point where we could actually provide recommendations or guidance on where to get those things. Present problems with invasive species is because we moved them all over the place. Aren't you reproducing this with native plants? That's where the evolutionary history of native plants versus non-native plants really comes into this conversation. The plants that are native in sort of the eastern US, let's say, are much more likely to have historical interactions in, paleohistory than non-native species that, then potentially became invasive when they were introduced to North America. And so that is one of the major points of distinction, I would say, with moving native species in response to climate change, so as a climate adaptation strategy, versus introducing plants from who knows where in the world that have, a number of aspects of their ecology that is really disjunct or distinct from what has happened within a particular continent. And that was one of the things that, both Bethany and Matt had pointed to, is trying to strike this balance between climate adaptation and sort of this recognition that native plants really are already empirically not keeping up with the pace of climate change. So like there's a very real risk of inaction. So balancing that risk of inaction with this risk of action of actually moving species around and trying to find that appropriate balance point of, how far is too far? What level ecoregion is the appropriate level of shared ecology to balance that risk. And quite honestly, if you've been to a retail nursery lately, there are plants from all over the world there, right? And so if that's one end of the spectrum of, plants that a gardener could choose to put in their garden, and then the like sort of extreme other end of the spectrum is only planting native plants that are native, historically native to, I don't know, I'm gonna just pick a number at random, but like 10 kilometers or 10 miles from the garden location. It's sort of this scale of hyper local to global. And so this resource is really through the lens of climate adaptation, aiming to find that middle ground. And co-authors, please feel free to unmute yourselves and chime in at any point if you've got additional points to add.
I can just add on to that the idea of taking, like genes or plant provenance, getting plants from a source that's not local, that's a little bit further afield, or that's in a climate adaptive direction, or even getting plants that haven't historically been in a place from somewhere that's a little bit warmer, is very much part of the climate adaptive restoration science these days too, that these really are fundamentally recommended by ecologists who work in restoration ecology, acknowledging that balance that Jenica was just talking about, that on the one hand, we want to avoid risk from invasions, and you've got a bunch of invasion ecologists sitting here, so we understand that perspective very well. But on the other hand, doing nothing is potentially actively doing harm, because climate is changing so quickly, that balancing those two factors is very much part of what the scientific recommendations for restoration and for conservation look like these days.
And maybe a reminder that like the majority of the plants on this list are already, we're talking about the ones that are here and are going to stick around. Like there's some portion of the list that's thinking about assisted migration or moving stuff that's maybe not always been here or have active populations here, but the majority of the list is stuff that is native and we think will continue to be healthy in the future. So not necessarily, like this is not necessarily an assisted migration or assisted gene flow resource, although like that is one component of it, but still the bulk of these plants are stuff that are native to some part of the Northeast and are already here and have healthy wild populations that we think are going to stick around. So that's just a reminder that this is not necessarily a full assisted migration resource.
And I'll just reiterate as well that in terms of, that potential risk of some unpredictable, impacts, we're thinking about this from that eco-evolutionary perspective that some folks have already shared, but we also did have state experts go through and like comb through our individual species lists. And that process was helpful for us to, remove particular species that folks were concerned about if they've seen, nuisance behaviors or tendencies for particular species. So that's another way that we've attempted to mitigate that risk in this resource.
I'll also just add that we're hoping that this resource is like a starting point for people to give us feedback on certain species. So if you're observing things escaping gardens or behaving in a way that you don't think is right, like we're totally willing to update our resource and also want to collect that information so we can inform future versions of the data set.
Great. And I want to be cognizant of the time. And so I'm going to go ahead and open up the very last question that we have for this group. which is what barriers have you experienced or have you heard your constituents have trying to plant native plants. I suspect it's going to take just a moment for folks to get back into Menti.
Jenica, you left out my common problem, which is that I'm bad at gardening.
I always call myself a very lazy gardener, right? Like I have, what traditionally would be considered poor garden soil. And so it has to be a really tough plant to make it here. And I am not going to give it a lot of care. So I've got all the tough stuff. So I'm with you, Thomas. So it's been interesting to watch for me anyway, the availability slider sort of like head back and forth. That is, I will say, one of the things that we hear about a lot is that people can't find the plants that they want, which is why we started with availability as the premise of this resource. But certainly have heard the feedback that native plants are expensive. I mean, plants in general have gotten more expensive, but native plants on average tend to be more expensive than their non-native compatriots. And then, yeah, some folks have had issues with plant labels being confusing or incomplete, though it sort of feels like we've got a two-parted distribution there. And then not knowing which species to choose seems like it's maybe the least common problem with this group anyway. So thanks for that. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing this screen. I see Carrie has her hand raised, so I'll go ahead and turn it over to Carrie.
Thank you. With regard to price of native plants, if you have a native plant society in your region, they're often an excellent source of native plants at a low price. Either they might be doing plant swaps because they have native gardens and they've got things that they need to remove from the garden, or maybe native seed swaps. Ours does one at the holiday season, and ours also provides very low cost, very small plants at a spring plant sale. So those are all ways that you might be able to find lower cost seeds.
Thanks for that recommendation. Yeah, and if other folks have recommendations for how to get your hands on lower cost plants, like please do feel free. You can raise your hand, drop your suggestion in the chat. I know I live in Connecticut, and we have conservation districts here that many of which run a spring plant sale, and they've been increasing the availability of native plants in those spring plant sales, and the prices are always much, much lower than you would find at a retail nursery. So if you happen to be in Connecticut, check out those conservation district plant sales. Awesome. Well, we are coming to the end of our time together. Thanks everybody for putting your thoughts into Menti, into the chat. I know it's been really active. We will certainly save this chat and aim to, answer questions if we're able to. We will send out a recording of this presentation afterwards as well to the Northeast Risk listserv. So if you want to re-listen to parts of it, you're able to do that. But now I'm going to turn it over to Matt to close us out for the day.
Yes, thanks, Jenica. Okay. Thanks all so much for coming. So there's going to be a brief survey that appears at the conclusion of the call. So please, if you can, take a few minutes to answer it so we can improve our future events. As Jenica mentioned, this was recorded, and we're going to make it available through an announcement on the listserv soon. Also, we encourage you, please join us at our next event, and it's very timely and relevant to the discussion we were just having, which is about assisted gene flow. So you can join us to learn about seed sourcing to promote climate resilience and discuss strategies for long-term restoration success. Registration and additional information for that event will be sent out to the listserv soon. So thank you all for joining us. It was great having you here, and you'll hear more from us soon.
Thanks everybody for joining us. We appreciate you.
Thank you.